Um, I'm John Haig. I am the co-director of the Mossavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government. I want to thank everybody for coming. We are extremely fortunate today. We have three people here. Edo Campanella. A little bit about Edo. Edo is currently a research fellow at the Center for Business and Government. He also is a UniCredit chief economist, basically, at UniCredit, and has been with us for quite a while, started as a senior fellow. He has significant experience. I mean, I could go on a bit, but he writes for things like Project Syndicate. I don't know if you've heard of Project Syndicate, but I would encourage you to go look at it. He's published in Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, Survival. He is a David Rockefeller Fellow of the Trilateral Commission. So he will moderate the discussion. And then we have Robert Lawrence, who I think many of you probably know. Robert is the Albert L. Williams Professor of International Trade and Investment. He's also a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He was at the President's Council of Economic Advisors from 1998 to 2000. And obviously, his real focus is on trade policy. Today, we'll talk between him and Dani. I think we have probably two of the world's experts on the question of will industrial policies revitalize the middle class. Robert has just come out with a book. We will have at the end a raffle where we will raffle off 5 of these his books. And then we have Dani Rodrik, who is the Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy here at the Kennedy School. And obviously his background is in economic development, international economics, and political economy. I hope he doesn't mind my saying this, but after the last few Nobel Prize winners, I was disappointed not to see Dani's name there. And I think it's just a matter of time, is my wish and hope. But with that, I will hand it over to Edoardo. And thank you all for coming.
So thanks a lot, John. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to see such a large crowd. John, you forgot to mention one of my greatest professional accomplishments. For 2 years in 2012-2014, I was one of Robert Lawrence teaching fellows. So that was quite a great experience for me. And it's nice 10 years later to be here and discuss his book. His book is a tremendous intellectual accomplishment. It's super timely. Robert basically dismantled the conventional wisdom about the number of manufacturing jobs that industrial policies can create. And he does so combining an engaging writing style with solid analysis made of empirical evidence and economic theory. And I'm delighted to be also with Dani on stage because Dani is one of those economists that has contributed the most to the debate about industrial policy, trying to rehabilitate an idea that was anathema for many years within the economic profession. So we can start discussing the book. The conversation will be around the book, not only about the book. We'll take we will try also to go a little bit beyond that to have a broader conversation. I prepared a few slides that I think can be useful for the audience to follow a little bit better the discussion. So, Robert, all around the world, governments are busy promoting industrial policies to revitalize the middle class. You basically argue in your book that this is delusional because it means fighting against structural forces that are pushing in the opposite direction. And you basically have this series of charts in your book where you show that the manufacturing employment share tends to rise at the when a country starts to develop, and then it tends to decline. And this is true also for China, that is the factory of the world. Can you explain us what's behind this inverted U shape for manufacturing employment share?
Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. Edo, with you and with Dani, who actually taught me a lot about this phenomenon and provoked me on occasion to think about it. Basically, it appears that there's a universal phenomenon, and it is characteristic of virtually every industrial economy, and it appears a lot of emerging economies too. And that is, as Edo shows you here, that as countries develop, they follow this U shape. And this is not widely appreciated. Everybody knows the share of farmers falls as countries develop, and that the share of services rises. But when it comes to manufacturing, they're not quite certain what the expected profile is. Now, in the book, in the first third, I actually develop a potential, a simple, parsimonious microeconomic model, which kind of explains that during the first phases of growth, a manufacturing employment tends to rise, not only because of income, which as people satisfy their need for food, they tend to spend on manufacturing, but also in countries where productivity growth in agriculture is growing rapidly, again, the overall demand is not sufficiently responsive as prices fall in response to that rapid productivity growth. So people tend to also shift their spending towards manufacturing and services. So the agricultural sector is a very important driver of manufacturing growth. However, as the agricultural sector shrinks, that source tends to diminish. And then there's another powerful effect which tends to dominate, which comes from the fact that fast productivity growth in manufacturing leads to cheaper goods, in combination with people's tendency to spend more on services as they get richer, and that force tends to be more powerful. Now, I've told you a story that is a closed economy, and that's kind of the first chapter of the book. And when you open it up, in the initial stages, if you're a small country, you can escape the effect of what manufacturing productivity is doing to your own employment by exporting. But eventually, that force also tends to weaken. And so what becomes dominant is that the share of manufacturing tends to fall. And it doesn't matter. What is really remarkable is that it is characteristic both of the countries that have trade deficits and of the most dynamic exporting countries as well. So it doesn't really matter in the long run. All countries appear, after they get rich, to experience this declining share in manufacturing. Now, if there's one thing that both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump agree on, it's the importance of revitalizing manufacturing as a way to restore middle-class incomes. Trump wants to close off the economy using tariffs, so he thinks the trade deficit, he thinks it can affect the trade deficit with the tariffs, and then he also thinks somehow that's going to do the trick. And she tends to put more, she'll use tariffs, but she's also going to put more emphasis on industrial policies. But I think my view, and Dani's as well, is that today manufacturing is about roughly 8% of US employment. And so even if they were right, that's too small to really have a major impact on the whole economy. But they're not, because in fact, this force is likely to sustain itself. So that's the first chapters in the book.
So thanks a lot. And maybe, Dani, before we start talking about the US in more details, I think it can be useful to preserve this sort of more global perspective. What Robert just discussed is really closely related to the idea of premature deindustrialization. It's a concept that you introduced a few years ago, according to which nowadays the manufacturing employment share for developing and emerging economies tend to peak at lower levels of income compared to the past. What are the reasons behind this? And maybe even more importantly, think how important is for a country to build a solid manufacturing sector for its own long-term prosperity prospects? Not an easy question, probably.
Yes. Thank you, Edoardo. First, let me just say something about Robert's the book, which I think is really excellent, and it comes as a very important time when we have made in not just in the United States but also in Europe, revitalizing the middle class is a very central and I think appropriate policy goal. And as Robert said, I share his concerns that the current approach, which focuses on manufacturing, is not going to do the job. But I think Robert has really marshaled an incredible array of evidence on this. And I think I do hope that it's going to start changing some of these views on both sides of the political aisle. But in any case, this is really a great book that comes out at the right time. Now, with respect to the specific questions you directed at me, Edoardo, the developing countries are going through their version of this problem, which, as you said, is, as I've called, premature deindustrialization. The way to think about premature deindustrialization is if you go back to your previous, this U curve, which Robert has talked about. What has been happening to this U curve, or the inverse U curve, is that over time it has been shifting down, which means that basically that the share of manufacturing employment every successive decade would be peaking at a lower level of the employment share in manufacturing, and also at a lower level of GDP per capita. So countries would be running out of employment opportunities in manufacturing at much lower, but smaller levels of industrialization, and when they were still much poorer. And that's the process. Why is this happening? It's happening largely for technological reasons, which is that manufacturing has become a lot less labor, sort of unskilled labor intensive, much more skill and capital intensive compared to before. So just to make this example very concrete, take a country like Ethiopia, which could have been what South Korea or Taiwan was back in the 1960s, a country that is very poor, endowed with lots of unskilled, relatively unskilled workers, but it has had tremendous difficulty, despite government policy, to promote the kind of industrialization based on garments or other sort of labor-intensive, traditional labor-intensive exportable commodities of the type that South Korea and Taiwan, before them Hong Kong, after them sort of China did. And you can see the changes in technology, sort of how now it is very different. So you have, a shoe, sort of one of the, most important investors in Ethiopian sort of export zones is a Chinese company that was set up in earlier decades in China to export shoes. When you talk to the executive of this company, she tells you that when we started out producing shoes for export in China, the only qualification we looked at our workers was basically if they could do this. The basic manual, some hand-eye coordination, which I always find hard to do. So that's one of the things that, it seems like it's easy, but if you're highly trained with a PhD, sometimes it's harder to do. But so that was the essential level of skill that was required to be employed Now, if you look at the same factory in their factories in the Ethiopian export zones, the educational qualification, the average level is about 8 years of schooling, which you might think, it's nothing, but it's actually above the average or median level of schooling in a country like Ethiopia. So you're talking about an industry which was supposed to be able to employ the resource that you have the greatest amount of, which is unskilled labor, but it's actually on average it's using labor that's more skilled than the average. So I think technological change and the nature of manufacturing technology, that when you're competing on global markets, the quality standards have risen significantly, and therefore you need to, that has had implications for the type of machinery and so forth. And that sort of has made it much more difficult for developing countries to compete in labor, what used to be labor-intensive manufacturing compared to before.
Thanks. And we will talk later on, we will discuss it later on, the kind of skills that are now needed to work in manufacturing and the kind of policies that might needed to help workers remaining competitive in the market. But I would like to focus first on industrial policies here in the US. So if I can go back to the slides. The Biden administration has adopted a number of legislation to try to revitalize the manufacturing sector. One is the Inflation Reduction Act that has little to do with inflation, but is still key as industrial policy here in the US. Then there is the Chips and Science Act. What we have seen over the last few years is that manufacturing employment has recovered the losses recorded during the pandemic, but it has roughly stabilized at the same level as the pre-pandemic era, whereas employment in non-manufacturing keeps rising. And at the same time, partly as a result of Biden industrial policy, what we are seeing is a boom when it comes to investment for the construction of new manufacturing plants. So the puzzle here is that basically we have an investment boom, but not an employment boom in manufacturing. Probably the Biden administration would argue that you first need to build a factory before you hire workers. So is that a possible explanation in your view, or it's delusional to expect an employment boom?
Well, let me just stress, I don't want people to get the wrong impression. Manufacturing is still very important as a supplier of certain goods that we really need. It's very important in decarbonization. We need solar panels. We don't necessarily have to make them ourselves, but we certainly need them. We need EVs. And as you go through, if you think of the digital age, we need semiconductors. And we need to decarbonize. And we needed infrastructure in the United States. So our industrial policies were important in the sense in the government filling gaps in what the market would otherwise have done in critical public areas. So I don't want to be interpreted as saying it isn't important. It's simply that it no longer provides mechanisms for major inclusion. And now, the White House, of course, by the way, I would also note that this message of manufacturing no longer a generator of significant amounts of middle-class jobs is one which is very hard to sell politically. Because first, there's a tremendous nostalgia for the good old days. And indeed, if you look back, you do see that manufacturing was a major driver of inclusion until roughly the late 70s, not only for individuals, but also for places. In the United States, we had poorer states, southern states, growing more rapidly than the rest of the economy, partly by attracting manufacturing firms to come and invest. So we had much more equal growth regionally. Since the 80s, we've had polarization of the economy. And in just as a lot of people focus on incomes, you also have to focus on places. So, and some of the places which were the hardest hit by deindustrialization happen to be very critical swing states. And it's those states today in which I think reinforce the proclivity of our leadership to point to manufacturing as a way to restore the middle class. Now, what I did, if you look at the data, and as Edoardo shows us, after the recovery, basically manufacturing employment in the US for 2 years has been flat. So despite maintaining tariffs on Chinese imports that were introduced by Trump, despite all the announcements and to some degree the implementation of industrial policies, we haven't seen employment growth in the aggregate. So what I thought I'd do in the book, I have a chapter in which I take, the White House has been tracking all these announcements of new investments. And they mirror the construction data, which make it look like there's this huge surge. And there is, in certain places in the United States, a surge taking place. But again, when you aggregate it up, what you find is it amounts to roughly, in the long run, once these policies are, once these factories are constructed, something like just over 1% of employment of the United States. So you're not going to be able to change the labor market fundamentally through these industrial policies. Moreover, if you look, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has a very good, every year they come up with a projection for the next decade of where are the jobs going to be in the United States. And their latest projection, which incorporates their estimates of what these industrial policies are going to do, but that's only the plus side of growth in manufacturing. They also incorporate many other industries where there are declines, and they conclude the share of manufacturing is going to continue to fall for the next decade in the US. So, the bottom line is we do have a revitalization in certain states. 4 of them happen to be key swing states as we look into this election, but they happen to be the Sun Belt swing states. The Rust Belt is not going to see much from these industrial policies in the way of job creation. But altogether, we have to start thinking about other policies, or to start emphasizing other policies, both for left behind people and left behind places.
So thanks, Robert. Dani, may I ask you your view about industrial policies here in the US, what the Biden administration got right and what got wrong?
Yeah, it's going to be boring because I think Robert and I really agree on this, and I agree with everything that he said. I'm a supporter of these industrial policies. I think it was, it wasn't that, industrial policy ever went away in the United States. There's a historical continuity, in the US in terms of the conduct of industrial policy. Well, what we think of industrial policies, often though it was early on, it was in agriculture, for example, with the land grant colleges in the 1860s and so forth, but essentially extension services and the provision of various incentives to promote productive upgrading. Of course, then, during the whole of after the Second World War, it was through the defense spending, procurement, DARPA, and so forth. And these efforts have often been behind many of the important innovations in the US economy. And so what is different now, I think, under Biden is that these industrial policy has become respectable again, and rather than sort of being carried out under the behind under the radar, so to speak. Sort of they're being touted as an important component of economic policy, so they become much more self-conscious, and I think that's on the whole is a good thing because they play a role. I think as as Robert said, I think there are good arguments for these industrial policies, even in manufacturing. So in promoting innovation, promoting supply chain resilience. I think and especially in the case of the green transition, promoting green industries, I think is extremely important. So I'm also support the IRA, which is very expensive in terms of tax incentives, but I think is really a fundamental transformation in the entire political economy of U.S. economic policy with respect to the climate transition. So I think it's extremely important. But again, just as Robert said, that's not going to the job. That's not going to do the job where job creation and good job creation and the middle class is concerned. I mean, just to add another piece of anecdote, like one of the biggest initiatives under the CHIPS Act, the industrial policies of the United States was the incentives given to TSMC to produce chips in Arizona. And now it's a huge success because now there are 3 plants that TSMC is building for a total capital cost of $65 billion. And the US federal government has given a subsidy of about $6.5 billion. It's a huge thing. The total number of jobs that this is going to create is about 6,000. And so, okay, then you can make the numbers look a little bit better by adding indirect creation of jobs and so forth. But it's just, this is the nature of manufacturing today. The other thing that I think makes me particularly pessimistic is to say, well, you can say, okay, all of this is backward looking, that, that maybe the future will be different, that once these plants come into operation and if these policies are considered, are continued, maybe we'll get employment in the future. If you look at the countries that we are trying to emulate, right, the countries that have actually been successful, supposedly, in what we want to be successful at, which is revitalizing manufacturing. Of course, these are countries maybe like, Taiwan or South Korea or China. Look at these countries. These countries, of course, have been very good in terms of investment in manufacturing, exports of manufacturing, production, value added in manufacturing. But you look at their employment, they've been falling too. I mean, if you look at South Korea is an incredibly telling example. If you look at the share of manufacturing value added in GDP at constant prices, it's like this, constantly is going up. If you look at the share of employment in manufacturing, it's sort of like this, going down. This disconnect between sort of how much labor you can absorb as you're producing more is a globally, is a universal phenomenon. I think there was a chart on China, right? If can we do as well as China? China has lost more workers in manufacturing in the last decade than the entire stock of manufacturing workers that exist in the United States today. More than, according to their own estimates, it's like more than $20 million, 20 million people, workers that have been, have been sort of the total manufacturing workforce has been reduced by, more than 20 million workers. You would never see it in their manufacturing output or investment or export statistics. So that keeps on increasing. So we can be successful at that end, but we're not going to be successful at creating those jobs. Again, so it's just a question of being, focusing on sort of what the objective is. I think manufacturing will always play a disproportionate role in an innovation. It's going to play a disproportionate role in the green transition, and that's why it's good to promote it. But if we care about sort of restoring the middle class, that's going to be through creating, good, well-paying, secure jobs with good protections and so forth. We just have to do something in services. That's where the jobs are going to be.
So we will get back to that in a second. I would like to focus for a moment on this idea that industrial policies are needed to speed up the green transition. And I think it's a fair argument. The problem is that in order to regain competitiveness in, for example, green tech, you in countries like Europe or the US, you need to combine industrial policies with trade protectionism. And paradoxically, you end up slowing down the green transition itself because you no longer have access to the cheapest green technologies that are available in the world. How would you advise a policymaker who needs to make this difficult decision between the ideal policy mix?
So first, first let's understand how important industrial policies are for the green transition. I think the single most important set of the single most important set of industrial policies around the world in the last 2 decades has been the green subsidies and the related industrial policies of China. And these policies have brought down the price of renewables by a magnitude that no one ever thought, sort of was going to be possible so quickly, has increased capacity in renewables much more rapidly than anybody sort of had projected. In effect, our greatest chance of sort of, winning the war against climate change today is due to these industrial policies, which have brought down the price of solar and wind and then electric batteries and so forth, to the point now where it's cheaper if you're installing new capacity, new power capacity, that is cheaper to use renewables than fossil fuels. So that's the magnitude of the significance of this. Now, I'm saying this because if we want to put this in the context of if a similar if the United States and then subsequently Europe are able to mount a similar effort with similar consequences, then I'm not in the least worried about some of the local content requirements, let's say, that the United States puts up in order to sort of, if you want to qualify for some of the added incentives on the IRA. I'm certainly not worried about the carbon border adjustment mechanism in Europe, if that's the price of having a realistic carbon price. So many of what sort of these protectionist policies that that one worries about are actually relatively small in terms of their costs compared to the benefits, not just potential, but actually the benefits that we've observed. Because let's also remember that when China was engineering this incredible reduction in the price of renewables, doing the entire world a huge service, the US and Europe were constantly complaining about Chinese industrial policies, Chinese policies of discriminating against foreigners and so forth. And I think with hindsight, we can say that those were really, sort of really worries that were completely minor compared to the scale of the transformation. Now, it is true. I'm sure Robert will want to say something about the U.S. tariffs on solar cells and electric EVs and so forth. And there is a real trade-off between sort of slowing down the transition on the consumer side versus promoting innovation on the producer side. I think that there are really two sides to the argument. One is, yes, these tariffs on solar panels in the US or in EVs are slowing down the transition on their own. The argument on the other side is that they have the potential of strengthening the producer lobbies for renewables. That is that, if the main reason that the US has been unable to move forcefully on carbon pricing and sort of phasing out fossil fuels in a more direct way has been because of the political force of the fossil fuel lobby. I think the logic with promoting sort of domestic producer interests in green industries even at some consumer costs, and sort of, the initial slowing down of the transition is by essentially changing that underlying political equilibrium, creating political winners who might then be sort of more willing to go along with carbon phasing out of carbon, eventually carbon pricing in the United States. But that's a kind of, I viewed as a political economy trade-off that one has to consider with some clear potential economic downsides as well.
Robert, do you want to?
Good. So we have some opportunity for differences of opinion. I think I understand that for political reasons, the IRA adopted subsidies rather than prices. What that means is we are wasting huge amounts of money in trying to promote a very desirable goal, but we're doing it in an incredibly inefficient way. So that if you look at the price equivalence into carbon of this whole IRA program, which some people estimate could cost as much as $1.2 billion, you get numbers. Trillion, I'm sorry, thank you. You get something like about somewhere between $10 and $20 a ton in terms of what you would get out of a price effect. A second question I have is whether the lobbies that you build up that are going to be in favor of greener policies, which was the type that Dani indicated, are going to counterweigh the lobbies that you're going to be building up in, say, solar panels, which are inefficiently produced in the United States. So just as we have a lot of trouble getting rid of protectionist lobbies in agriculture when we can't produce those kind of products, I think we're doing the same in solar panels. And by the way, so I asked my ChatGPT to tell me what is the elasticity of demand for solar panels. And it surveyed the literature and it came up with the number 2. And if you look at the price of solar panels in China, they're about $10. For equivalent measure, they're about 15 in the world market, and they're about 30 in the United States. So I think we've been forced, for political reasons, to use the wrong instruments. And that's going to make it costly, and that's going to slow down this process. The alternative is what the Europeans have done, which is to do the right thing, and that is to put a price on carbon. But what you discover there, and Edo and I have written on this, is it is not politically popular, and it will become increasingly so. And the real challenge is how can we persuade people to change their behavior when these initiatives themselves are not popular politically. One obvious thing to do, which has been done in a few European countries, but not enough, is to redistribute the money in form of a green dividend so that people at least would feel that they were being made whole. A second is to be much more effective in dealing with those who are dislocated. We haven't done well. We didn't do well in international trade. And if you look carefully at the IRA, there's kind of a dominant vision that we're going to turn places that are currently dependent on fossil fuels into places that are green energy hubs. And, you know, the coal in the ground and the sun shining and the wind blowing don't necessarily occur in the same places. And so what we need are much more tailored place-based policies to deal with those dislocated areas. But finally, I think at the end of the day, people are only going to be persuaded to go green, or some people, half the people, will only be persuaded to go green when the technologies themselves are much less expensive than the fossil fuel-based alternatives. And so I think far more emphasis is needed on research and development. There isn't enough of it. And ultimately, using the most efficient suppliers to get us these technologies at the lowest cost has to play a critical role. So I guess I'm less optimistic about a purely laissez. I'm using the word laissez-faire, but it's in a completely different context to the traditional one, to say, well, look, let each country do what's politically pragmatic in that country as the way to deal with this problem. I still believe that efficiency matters, and we should be trying to do this in a coherent and efficient manner, because ultimately, I think we want to get this thing done as rapidly as we can, and make it as attractive as we can to people to adopt these greener technologies.
So thanks, Robert. We are running out of time. We have 10, 15 more minutes. So I have a long list of questions, but I think I will skip them just to allow the audience to ask a question. I don't know if, John, maybe you want to start, or...
I mean, I'm happy to start, but we have a lot of people, and I want to make sure
Collect a few
that ask their questions. But I mean, a natural question is that when you think about the different industrial policies of different countries, and even within the United States, people tend to look at it through different lenses. And by that, I mean they have different objectives. And what I'm not sure is how to resolve those different objectives in terms of the specifics of what policies look like. So if you're thinking about we should help the people in West Virginia because it's a coal-based, fossil fuel-based economy, and we need to do some place-based economics to help address that. That's one objective, and that may lead you down a certain set of policy choices. If you think, to Robert, your point about we need to support more research and development, you might be thinking, should we be putting kind of the effort around academic institutions and other kind of lab-driven kinds of locations that would support that R&D. And if I'm thinking about we want to make sure we maintain a position in semiconductors, so therefore we're going to incent TSMC to come build in the United States, and we're going to provide subsidies to Intel, I might say, let's put the money into Arizona and manufacturing plants of one sort or another. And what I don't know is how those different policy objectives get resolved in some way that is rational and not purely political, which may be the answer. I don't know. I'd be curious to hear both of your reactions.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So I think the economic and political logics here diverge, and I think good the good statesmanship or good sort of, I think the kind of skill that we would hope our students here would acquire, it would be essentially to find a way between those two logics without doing, without excessively trying to focus on the efficiency at the cost of what's needed to get all the political stakeholders together and sort of hang your your flag on the efficiency pole, but essentially not get anything done. I think, and the other is basically forgetting why you're doing these things, and then just get politically something done, but it gets disconnected from what will actually work. So I think the economic logic here suggests, yes, we have diverse objectives, and each one of them require a somewhat different tool. So you target your tool to the objective. So if your objective is innovation, basically you just promote innovation through R&D incentives and subsidies. If your objective is to revitalize places that are left behind or which have lost jobs, then you basically employ place-based strategies, which are going to be heavily necessarily focusing on services and smaller and medium-sized enterprises. if your objective is geopolitical advantage over China, then you're really just looking at the supply chains where your vulnerabilities are and trying to focus on those choke points or where you can exert geopolitical leverage. So the economic logic says you have to be clear about what your objective and target your policies. The political logic says, well, to do anything in Washington, you need to bring a whole bunch of people together to agree. So of course, when you're going to pass chips, you're going to say it's, for a geopolitical advantage and it's for left behind places, it's for innovation, it's for good jobs, it's for the middle class. And besides, we're also going to call it, fighting inflation.
Yeah.
And so that's the political logic, and one can understand that. But so somewhere in between, you hope that the policymakers, and of course, if you talk to the Biden administration officials, people in the CHIPS office, I think they are aware of all of these things, and I think statesmanship. So I mean, I like to repeat this as something that my thesis advisor, used to say, is that the world is second best at best. And so, I understand the arguments about efficiency, but I also, there's a reason why, the United States, was never able to pass carbon pricing. And I think the IRA is going to put us in a much better place with respect to the green transition than an alternative that never materialized. And I think not only was unlikely to materialize, but it's actually more likely to materialize with IRA policies in place.
Thanks. And Robert?
Well, 90% I agree at that. In fact, I have a working paper about biofuels, and the title is How Good Politics Leads to Bad Economics. And basically, the more you claim for your policies, the more likely you're going to get support. And so you have multiple goals. But I also think it's how you get into a terrible mess when you actually implementing the policies. And you find yourself doing all kinds of inconsistent things. It's inherent in the logic of what you've promised people. If we promise people that we're going to decarbonize, but in addition, it's going to make us competitive with respect to our trading partners, and it's going to create jobs, and we're going to use the opportunity to raise union presence in the economy, and we don't deliver, we're going to put the good things, we're going to reduce the reputation, if you will, for the good things we're trying to achieve because of the bad things that become associated with it. But I think, John, you've put your finger, and the one that I think I'm most concerned about is the use of national security as a pretext, because I think there's no clarity over exactly what the term means, and it's leading us to, it's a lovely metaphor that Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, has of a small garden with a high fence, but in fact, that garden looks much more like a very large field. And by the way, even the fence isn't as high as he thinks it is, because we have a lot of sort of leakage. So it's a very, very knotty question.
So just in the interest, can I ask Robert a question in the interest of clarifying whether there's a difference, or it's just what? I mean, would you say, for example, that the IRA, that we would be better off without the IRA?
No.
Or are you saying that if you were to design the IRA or something similar, you would have done it better, John?
Well, look, of course I would have done a better job. No, look, I don't know what was the minimal amount of, and I think what Dani has said is, in fact, I think why I hope our students from the Kennedy School can do good in the world. It's one of the many reasons, but this is one of the reasons. Can we figure out a way to minimize the distortions when we actually implement policies that we think could achieve good goals? And I don't know what the true politics were underlying the IRA. Was it really necessary to make the concessions which were made to efficiency and extraneous goals in order to get it through the Congress. And you know, there was Joe Manchin alone had to be bought out, and what he decided and how he decided, you know, turned out to be important. No, I would support it, and I'm holding my nose. And then there's a question of its sustainability, and we can talk more next week, because we in the course of some of the bells and whistles that we have added to the IRA in order to make it politically viable today, so that this idea that we've got a big bonus in there for paying union wages, the first measure that the new Republican Speaker of the House passed was a repeal of the IRA when he was appointed. And so I don't know how many of those political compromises that were made are going to enhance the sustainability of the program. You might have thought that Republicans, and Dani gave us the argument, you know, as it turns out, a lot more of the places where the sun shines and the wind blows tend to be Republican. You might think that's going to build up a new constituency in support of these programs. So far, very little evidence of that, surprisingly. So I think these are all unknowns. I do think we're better off with than nothing, but I would far have preferred something more efficient.
So thanks. I think we can try to put together a couple of questions from the audience. Maybe over there.
Thank you for the interesting presentation. I want to go back to the question of the relationship between industrial policy and employment for the middle class. Your thesis is very deterministic and a little bit pessimistic that middle class inclusion would not be possible. I don't personally believe this, but I want to kind of challenge that a little bit. I think the underlying assumption and the paradigm that we're working with is a shareholder maximization principle in the US or globally. We are saying that if there's a greater gain and return on capital in how we do economics, then we will value that. And so far, the reason that machines are able to replace humans is that we see a greater return in investing in machines over investing in humans. And we are creating a tax structure where the capital gain tax is much lower than the income tax. And I wonder if we do change from that shareholder maximization value to one that's stakeholder maximization value, where we can say that, hey, let's create a tax system where we subsidize the employment of labor for businesses. And at the same time, we would try to incentivize businesses to develop technologies that employ humans rather than replace humans. This reminds me of the talk that Professor Darren Acemoglu was talking about when he was here a couple of weeks ago about how technologies are not being developed for working with humans. So I'm curious about whether there could be a more fundamental paradigm shift from a shareholder value maximization to one that's focusing on stakeholder maximization, if we recognize the positive externalities that we can get from employing more workers in the longer term.
Thanks. It's a very fascinating question. Maybe we can see if there is another one, and then very shy audience. So we can maybe start from this one.
Well, I am dubious. I guess Dani will give a different answer, I think, I would predict. I'm dubious about our ability to steer the direction of technological change, even if we were to give more rewards to employment. I think, but I do think at least a tax system that was neutral between labor and capital at the very least would be a desirable characteristic. Nonetheless, you know, innovation and inventions work in mysterious ways. It's certainly true that relative prices will affect at adoption of these different kinds of technologies. But I'm not sure that we have a good handle, as good a handle, I guess, and I'm much less confident that we have a handle on exactly the way to do this. In particular, the point I'll make is that we're trying to build a middle class on a broad base. And what my study of structural changes, of the literature on structural changes taught me, is that often the people who can get rewarded aren't necessarily those who directly produce the products. So my favorite example, and I noticed in a new book that Dani is writing, he used the same example, is barbers. The income of barbers has risen at the same rate as ordinary workers, for the last century. And that's basically because you don't necessarily get paid according to your own individual productivity in a particular job, but the way in which people like you get paid across the economy. And so developing, what I would hope is that developing a more productive economy in some places will raise incomes and then later create opportunities for other workers. So just let me point, Zoom has done a phenomenal thing. It has allowed people to live far away and work remotely. And I think this is part of the way in which we can revitalize the depressed outlying areas. That is to say, to attract highly productive people to go and live in faraway places, and then half of their consumption expenditure will be made in those new locations. So I think the mechanisms by which we will raise a new middle class won't only be directly through the technologies that are created, but through the indirect, if you will, expenditure spillovers that can also occur as a result of these new technologies.
Dani?
Yeah, I mean, I'm more optimistic than Robert that we can steer technology if we make a decisive change in that direction, and we have evidence of that. I mean, I was talking about the decline in the renewables prices. That was a decisive shift in sort of what kind of technology we want to promote. If you want to, promote green technologies, you can, have more innovation in that direction. Similarly, in the United States, we've made, decisive decisions, investments in promoting defense and defense-related technologies, and we've been saying. So I think that is possible, but I think the reason I don't think it's possible to have a real impact on sort of manufacturing jobs is just a quantitatively that the base of manufacturing jobs right now is so small to begin with. That it is not realistic to expect a quantitatively meaningful change. And the evidence for that is to say, again, to look like a country like China, where you can say, well, the cost of labor in China is a fraction of what it is in the United States. And so certainly the capital to labor price ratio is much higher in China than it is in the United States by a margin. But even China is sort of losing manufacturing workers, not just in relative terms, in absolute terms. So quantitatively, I think it just isn't going to make a big difference.
Could I just add one more point? So I just want to follow on what Dani was saying. So there's supply and there's demand, and in a sense, what's omitted from a lot of discussions about this deindustrialization is the role of demand. What do people want to buy? How many manufactured goods how do they want to allocate their spending? And what you find over time is that as people get richer, they want to allocate a smaller share to manufactured goods. So there's another constraint that's coming from this demand side. And my own view, for instance, there's this whole debate about why did America lose all these jobs after 2000? And we've got people who say the Chinese took them, and we've got another group of people who say the robots took them. But there's a third component, which was we had 2 big recessions during that period. And what I try to show in my study is that demand played a huge role. The demand for goods is very cyclically sensitive. So I think whenever countries set out to enhance their manufacturing employment, they cannot simply take the demand side for granted. They have to explain who's going to buy what they sell. Sometimes it may be the international market, but generally that's another constraining factor that I think we need to incorporate. We need a 3 causation model.
And talking about the demand for goods, it's also important to emphasize that some goods become digital. So this is, for example, books is the easiest example.
Yeah, and this is why if you want my book, you could on November 12th, it'll be on Amazon as a Kindle version. So please keep your eye out.
So on this, I think we can close it here. We are 10 minutes late. I want to thank Robert and Dani for this very insightful conversation. I want to thank all of you for showing up. Now there is the lottery for Robert's book. If you don't win it, I recommend you to buy it anyway, physical or digital, whatever you like. And we can stop it here. So thanks a lot. Have a nice rest of the day.